This is your house. These are your neighbors' houses. How many of these neighbors do you know by name? Go ahead, try to name them. If you're like most people these days, you probably only know a few of your neighbors by name. We have garages for our cars, privacy fences for our backyards, and we seem to be perpetually busy. You're doing pretty well if you wave or say hi as you're passing by. But what if we did more? What if we made it a point to learn the names of the people who live on our block? What if we took the time to listen to our neighbors and find out what makes them tick? What if our neighborhoods relied on each other in times of need, whether it be for a cup of flour or a shoulder to cry on? What if Jesus really meant that we should love our actual neighbors? Imagine the difference you could make in your neighborhood if you got to know your neighbors better.
How many you got? Maybe we know at least some of you can do all, because we ended up giving away a lot of books last week. But hey, good morning again. Welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Matt. I'm one of the pastors here, and we are thinking about neighboring today. Neighborhoods seem to have changed over the last couple of generations. I remember stories that I would hear about from my grandparents that would describe what life used to be like on their streets in the old days, right? They would tell me it wasn't like this way back when, and they would describe for me and paint a picture for me of what life was like on their streets. Similarly, I've gotten images in my mind from movies and from books that depict what was life like in neighborhoods 50, 70, even 100 years ago. And one of the pictures that we get from those who have gone before us is neighborhoods in which people actually knew each other. They would talk across the fence. They would sit on rocking chairs. I know you guys can't see, but they would sit on rocking chairs in their front porch sipping tea, and the neighbors would walk by, "Hey, Vern," and they would stop and they would talk. It was this kind of vibrant interaction of people hanging out on front yards, mowing their lawns, watering their plants, clipping hedges, sipping iced tea, going for strolls, interacting, talking with one another. But if you were to walk through in the evenings through our neighborhoods, they don't all quite seem like that. Mostly we see people indoors. So what happened? This is something that became of great interest to me. A couple years ago, I started researching, and I actually went on this long research rabbit trail, reading sociological studies of how neighborhoods have changed. And it was interesting to see that technology and advancements in technology and advancements in wealth actually have led to people being more isolated. Even down to small technologies like automatic sprinklers or advancements of being able to hire gardeners, all of these kinds of things get people out of their front yards. But the two innovative changes that most affected the neighborhood life was, number one, in the 1950s, air condition became popular. Before that time, homes used to get very hot during the day, and then people would cook the evening meal, and that would further heat up the house. And the heat in many places, I know that here in the Bay Area, it's not quite as bad as maybe other places, but homes would get very hot, and it would just naturally push people out to their front, out to get the breeze that was outside on their porches. And as in the 50s and then the early 60s, as air conditions became so widely spread, people were able to go inside where it was more comfortable. The second big technological innovation was television. When televisions became popular and became in every home, people then, the source of their entertainment, instead of just being the most exciting thing happening was outside with the neighbors, the most exciting thing was happening inside with whatever was coming on the screen, the innovations of television and air conditioning in particular has pulled people back from the street back into their homes. Another physical center of leisure besides the front porch and the street was the public pool. The public pool was an inadvertent casualty. This is actually a picture of the Alum Rock pool that used to exist and no longer does at Alum Rock Park. Public pools were a place where neighbors would gather together and play together and know each other and talk. But public pools have been disappearing all across the country, replaced by personal backyard pools and by private clubs. Now, it's a sad fact in American history that funding for public pools and the creation of new public pools disappeared. That funding started ceasing and those started falling apart and disappearing across America. The sad fact is that it plummeted at exactly the same time in which these pools were racially integrated. And so it turns out that for many people, they wanted to hang out with their neighbors, but not all their neighbors. And so when that happened, people started finding other ways to swim. My own childhood in the 1980s, people were no longer hanging out on their porches. They had the television, they had the air condition. But you know who hung out on the street is kids. Kids would go out and play, and I'd come home from school, and I'd run around. And the first thing I would do is I'd get my bike. Okay, now this is not my actual bike from the 1980s. Mine was much larger and had pedals. Okay, but I would get on my bike, and I would ride my bike with all the other kids in the neighborhood. We'd hear the ice cream truck come by, and we'd all take off looking for the ice cream truck after we foraged for change in the couches. And we'd have 15, 16 kids like chasing down the ice cream truck. And I just remember we'd ride our bikes, we'd play sports, we'd interact. I knew every neighborhood kid. As soon as there was a new neighborhood kid going, we would be right over there in their front yard. We'd play, all the kids together until it was dark, until the parents started whistling and it was time to go in for the meal. We played and interacted on the streets. Now, you don't really see that so much in evenings now, do you? Now, what has happened there? Well, there's a number of changes that have happened in our society that have made it so that doesn't happen. One of those is just increasing pressure on kids. The amount of homework that they have to do has grown. The amount of homework that parents add to them, the amount of classes and skills that they're supposed to be training in a formal, scheduled way has just increased dramatically. The pressure put on kids by parents, by teachers, by coaches has increased. There's also video games and phones have come in and taken their attention. Another massive thing happened. COVID happened. And it taught people to stay in their homes, to shelter in place, to stay away from other people as much as possible, and train them for multiple years to be in isolation. All of these things, the air condition and the television, the video games, the academic pressure, the extra thing from coaches, COVID, all of these things have made it so you don't see as much all the kids of neighbors playing together. It may be that in our time, we live in a world where people simply don't know or talk to their neighbors more than any time in recent memory. We think of our neighbors by nicknames that we've made for them, by the cars that they drive. And against this backdrop, against this anonymous, busy, hectic, unneighborly world, we hear Jesus' voice all the more call out to us, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus calling to us on this topic is more cross-cultural, more countercultural in our day and age than in ages past. It takes more effort to love our neighbor, to actively swim against the stream of all these factors which have served to isolate us from those we live near. Because this is such an important command for Jesus, and because it's so difficult to practice in this day and age, we're devoting these 6 weeks to just seeking if we can get better at obeying Jesus. We have a book that we're using as a companion piece called The Art of Neighboring. It's available in the back at the Info Center we're selling to you at cost. And we just encourage you to get it, to read it. There's discussion questions in your life group, and we'll be teaching here on it. Can we get better at loving our neighbor as ourselves? So I want to just do a quick review of last week. If you missed last week or if you've forgotten it, a quick review. Number 1, Jesus warned us not to neglect the most important commands. Specifically, he was talking to the Pharisees, teachers of law. He says, Pharisees and teachers of law, woe to you, for you tithe on your mint, your cumin, and your dill, like your garden herbs, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, love, justice, and mercy. He's saying don't major on the minors and neglect the most important things. Secondly, Jesus told us what the most important things were. He was asked, hey, what's more important? There's tons of laws and commands. What's the most important? And Jesus didn't say, oh, they're all important, so do them all equally. He said, well, okay, here you go. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Let me read this to you because it's so important. Verse 36. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. Right? Everything else flows out of these. Everything else can be summarized in these 2 things, to love God and love neighbor. Okay, third piece for the review from last week is any definition of neighbor must include the most obvious, which is literal neighbors. Any definition of neighbor. So we stretch it. Jesus intentionally stretched it with the Good Samaritan story, in which he stretches it to people who are different from us, people that we might stumble along, right? People who we might not want to be neighborly to. But any definition, however we think about neighbor, is going to include the actual literal meaning of the word, the person who lives next door to me, the person who lives right around me. It's going to include that. And for some of us, as we've stretched our understanding of neighbor, I want to be neighborly to that person across town. I want to be neighborly to my friend at work. I want to be neighborly to that person across the ocean. Some of us, our application of this has become like a donut, where we reach far, but then there's a hole in the middle right around us of our actual literal neighbors. But any faithful application, any faithful interpretation of neighbor is going to include our actual literal neighbors who live next door. Review number 4 is loving our neighbor is helped when we actually know their names. There's a ceiling to how much we can have a relationship with someone if we are always stuck at, hey there, dude, hey there, neighbor. When we know their names, it humanizes them, it deepens the relationship, it forms a foundation for actually having an authentic, loving relationship for them. It's hard to love people when you don't even know their names. Lastly, we had a block map challenge. So if you don't have this, you can get one in the back. This is a refrigerator magnet just to help you. It's kind of just a little map, and you can kind of reconfigure it however you want. But it's just a challenge to just simply learn the names of your closest 8 neighbors. Can you learn the names of your closest 8 neighbors? I did a experiment with the staff in which we all had to kind of draw this with we all drew the kind of tic-tac-toe and fill in the names of our neighbors. And one of them was pretty hilarious because one of the people filled it in with the nicknames, right? Because that's what we do. We just know the nicknames of our neighbors, how we refer to them if we can't remember their names. And this one just cracked me up. So, all right, I'm just gonna read for you. I wish I could show you, but I'll just read it to you. Okay, here's the names of this particular person's neighbors. Okay, there's the grumpy couple. There's the pallet people. Never seen. Holly the hermit. Crazy lady. Loud music guy. Saul and the little girl with chickens and roosters. And then finally, their son smokes pot in a van. You know? This is kind of how we know our neighbors, right? They're strangers to us, and we know them by their weirdest quality or their most annoying activity, right? So that's where we're at. Maybe that's the baseline for many of us. But how do we move forward from there? How do we just take some kind of baby steps towards like what Jesus would have us know? How do we just take baby steps? How do we know their name? How do we have some kind of loving relational engagement with them? Hey, I don't want to just call you to things. I want to try to report some accountability for myself. I want to just admit to you, this is not an area where I feel like I'm doing great. This is an area where I want to grow, okay? So remember we had the challenge last week, how many neighbors you know? Hey, I sat down real early, okay? But made a little progress this week, okay? So I actually learned, I told you there was this older lady, I don't know her name. I found out her name is Judy because my son told me. I was like, I got to learn her name. He's like, you mean Judy? I was like, oh, how do you know? I was like, Dad, we all know her name. Okay, great. So I found that out by asking one of my kids, okay? I found out her husband's name is Doug. How did I find that out? I found it on a website I'll tell you about later, okay? But don't tell him, okay? I met another couple that's just a little bit down the street named Mark and Karen. Met them while just playing football with my kids, just playing catch outside with my kids. They came along, made a comment of like, oh, I remember those days. And we ended up talking, having a great conversation for like 20 minutes and finding all these kind of points of connection. And it was great. So I'm making a few baby steps. I hope you will be too. I want to start by giving us some practical ideas, just uber practical ideas on just how can you push through that barrier of not knowing your neighbor's name. So what are some practical strategies for learning your neighbor's names? Okay. We'll pull them up. Number one, use the fridge magnet. Write them down as you learn it. So I'm putting this on my fridge, and I actually have a little dry erase marker that I'm using because sometimes I just learn partial names, or sometimes I'll begin with a nickname, and I'll erase it when I get a real name. Okay, so using this, and then it helps me because sometimes what happens when I meet someone, if I don't write it down somewhere, I immediately forget it, and I'm like, oh, now I'm in a bind. Now I can never ask their name again, right? But no, it's not like that. But so use the fridge magnet to track what you actually know. Number two, you could ask them. It's actually not as awkward as you think to say to someone, say, you know what, I remember learning your name. I just cannot remember it, but I want to. Can you just tell me, one more time, what's your name, right? Remind me that. You can do that. And then the secret is, then you write it down and don't forget it again, okay? So you could ask, okay. Number three, you could ask a different neighbor. Okay, this is one that I use. I'll say, hey, Maurice, I'm so embarrassed. What's your neighbor's name on that side of the fence? Hey, what? Oh, okay, it's okay, that's great, right? Hey, you can ask one neighbor that you do know if they know the other names, okay? Number four, you could read your neighbor's mail. Just kidding. Don't do that. It might be a felony, I'm not sure, but just don't, I wouldn't do that one. Number five, you could sign up for Bless Every Home. This is something that I've heard from a number of Bay Area pastors. There's a Bay Area pastor network that's really been recommending this, and I've just kind of tried it out. It's pretty interesting. So as long as you use it right, you can use it wrong, I'm sure. But you can sign up for Bless Every Home. It's a website. And you just create a login. It actually has an app on your phone, and it's pretty cool. It's designed to foster neighboring movements among Christians throughout the country. And what it does is you put in your address, and you sign up that you can actually mark what church that you're a part of, and it will show you the houses right around you, and you click which ones you want to be praying for. and it tells you their names. It actually, has them listed. Now, sometimes they'll be inaccurate if someone's moved recently, but it actually has it. It's a help, particularly if you've already met someone and you just need a reminder. Don't be all awkward and like, hey, I looked you up online and found out your name is Fred. I mean, that'd be so weird, okay? But if you've forgotten their name and you just need a little help, that's helpful. But the other thing it does is you can click, hey, which one? Hey, I commit to pray for my 4 closest neighbors, and it'll send you it'll send you a reminder email every week. Hey, did you pray for Fred? Okay, don't forget about that, and you can actually track that. So it's pretty cool. So bless every home. You can sign up, and you can list that you're part of our church there. So here's what I want to do. I want to practice. I want you to have a quick discussion with your pew neighbor. Okay, so someone who's near you, don't leave anybody out. Make sure everyone's included. Just find a partner, and I want you to simply discuss what is your favorite of these 5 suggestions. Which one is the one you'd most likely to use? And then secondly, if you have a better idea. Okay, so which is the best of these 5, and do you have a better idea? So let's take a couple minutes with your neighbor and discuss. Awesome. All right. I love it is engaged. People are fired up, I think, and strategizing here, thinking about it. Quick show of hands. How many people liked number 1 the best? How many people number 2? Number 3? Number 4? Mike, yeah, over here. And number 5. All right, I actually don't know which one's most popular, but okay, good. All right, it's all different folks. Okay, so those are some practical ideas. Raise your hand if you had a better idea. Okay, awesome. I want you guys to email me your better idea. I want to share some of those next week if you guys had a good idea. Okay, so let me move on. So one of the things that I think holds us back from really loving our neighbors well is just time and stress about time, right? We live our lives with pretty hectic schedules. You're busy people. I don't think any of you walked in this morning thinking to yourself, I've just got a pile of free time with no ideas on how to spend it. I hope Pastor Matt gives me some ideas of what I could do with my free time. I don't think many of you walked in like that. Many of you are working full time. Many of you are caring for kids or a spouse or a parent that needs you. Many of you are volunteering a ton of time at church or a local charity. Maybe you're on a board. Maybe you're coaching a sport. I'm doing a lot of those things I just mentioned, and I feel very busy. You probably also have so many relationships in your life already, and you think to yourself, I can't even maintain those relationships. Why should I go making more relationships? Most of us are living busy, overly scheduled lives, and we often feel pressure from this hurried life, and we struggle to stop and include anything else. Anybody relate to that? I think a lot of us, right? But once again, somehow from the place of our busy lives, once again we hear the command of Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself, and somehow we're called to slow down, to maybe say no to a few things, to create some space for what Jesus called to be the most important. Last week we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I'll just summarize it for you. Jesus is stretching our understanding of neighbor, right? He said, love your neighbor as yourself, and the person wanted to justify himself. So, okay, well, who is my neighbor, wanting to limit it? And Jesus sought to stretch our understanding of neighbor. There was 3 men that walked by somebody in need, and 2 of them saw the human need but decided their life could not be interrupted. But one of them dropped everything he was doing and allowed his life to be greatly interrupted and helped. In 1973, there was a famous experiment done, a kind of a sociological study done with using Princeton Theological Seminary students as test subjects. So these are all students training to be pastors. This was done by John Darley and Daniel Batson, and it involved the Good Samaritan story. So essentially it went like this. The seminary students were brought into one location, and they were told, okay, we need you to, you have this many minutes to prepare a talk that you're going to give, and then that you're going to give it to a group of people across the campus on this other building. So they're in one building preparing a talk, and they're going to walk down this path to this other building where they're going to give the talk. They had them fill out questionnaires, all kinds of things about their personality, all kinds of things about their religious temperaments, and they're testing all these different factors. And then they planted somebody on the path that was in need. So every single one of them who's like, okay, I'm preparing a talk and I'm going to go give that talk, every single one of them is going to walk and pass by someone on the ground who's coughing and moaning in obvious signs of distress. And then what they were really measuring was not their talk, they were measuring their response to the person in need. And they were testing all these different factors to see what's going to be conducive to whether someone, is able to, chooses to stop and help somebody or continues on their way. And none of the factors on the survey had any statistical significance, not their personality type, not their age, not their religious temperament. None of those things had statistically significant impact on did they help the person. Then they did, part of the experiment was they changed what they were giving a talk on. So half the group was told, you're going to give a talk on career opportunities to this other group of people. The other half said, you're going to preach on the Good Samaritan story. Isn't that crazy? So half of them were to preach on the Good Samaritan story about stopping to help someone who's walking on the path. And it did not make a statistically significant difference that they were preaching on Good Samaritan. It made some, but it was not the biggest factor, because 47% of the pastors in training who had just spent the last 30 minutes preparing a talk and were literally walking to prepare to preach on Good Samaritan, saw the person in need and just kept going. Some of them said they actually stepped over the person in need to go preach on the Good Samaritan. Wow. But there was one factor that determined by a landslide if the person stopped to help. And it was the amount of hurry that was applied to the test subject. 1/3 of the people were told, hey, if you leave now, you'll get there early, and that would be good. You'll be there in plenty of time. You'll be early. And of the people who were told that they were not in a hurry, 63% of them stopped and helped the person in need. 1/3 of them were told, hey, if you leave now, you'll get there right on time. And it dropped to 45% of those people helped them. But 1/3 of them were told, oh no, you're already late. You've left too late. Even if you leave now, you'll arrive late. And only 10% of those people who were told they were in a great hurry stopped to help. Even if they were going to preach on the story of the Good Samaritan, they're like, I'm late, and so I won't. But in the story, that might have been the reason the first two people did not stop. And this study, I think, is a great call to us that we need to slow down. When we're in a hurry, we're far less likely to obey the commands of Jesus, even if we're on our way to preach about them. Are we ready to slow down in order to obey more? One of the striking things about Jesus in the gospel stories is just how interruptible he is, right? He's Jesus. He's the Son of God on the greatest mission in human history. You might expect him to not be open to interruptions. In fact, the disciples themselves expected him to not want to be interrupted. And they are frequently, in the gospel stories, the disciples are frequently telling people, don't interrupt Jesus. He's busy and he's important. And Jesus is constantly correcting them and allowing to be interrupted. Let me read some examples. Mark 10:13. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. And when Jesus saw this, he was indignant at the disciples, not at the kids for interrupting. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly I tell you that anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." And he took the children in his arms, placed his hands on them, and blessed them. Right? The disciples think, "Oh no, too busy, too in a hurry, don't interrupt." And Jesus says, no. I'm going to take time for these people who are right there, these kids. Same thing happens with blind Bartimaeus in Mark 10:46. When they came to Jericho, as Jesus and his disciples together with a large crowd were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And many people rebuked him and told him to be quiet because he's bothering an important person who's busy, right? But he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And so they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received sight and followed Jesus along the road. Same story, different character. Jesus allowed himself to be interrupted. Mark chapter 5 is full of similar examples. There's a violent, demon-possessed man who's very strong and can break chains, and people are scared of him. And he comes, and Jesus says, no, let me interact with him. He takes time with him. Later in the story, Jairus, who's a synagogue leader, interrupts Jesus to come heal his sick daughter. He's like, excuse me, my daughter is sick, would you come? And Jesus drops everything and is going to go heal the young daughter. But then he gets interrupted from the interruption when there's this woman who's been bleeding who interrupts the interruption. He stops and he goes and he helps her, and then he continues on his way to the daughter. Jesus is somehow living in such a way that he's able to interrupt his busy schedule and his busy plans to engage with the people nearby that he crosses paths with. To be a disciple is to seek to love Jesus and follow Jesus by walking the way of Jesus, by acting like Jesus, by structuring our lives and being like Jesus to the people around us. And he slowed down his pace to connect with them and to be interruptible. So how can we begin to be interruptible, be available for the people around us? Here's another 5 practical ideas, 5 practical ways, okay, on how we might be more available, small changes that we can make to be more available for relationships with our neighbors. The first one, and this actually is an idea that comes from one of the pastors who wrote this book, is simply a physical restructuring of our furniture. So the pastor of the book describes just simply moving 2 items from the backyard to the front yard. So he moved a table and chairs, kind of a lawn table and chairs that he and his wife like to sit at, and they moved it to the front yard. And then they also had a backyard swing that their kid liked to swing on, and they just moved that to the front yard. And then it was just by simply moving the furniture that they started spending more time in the front, and then they would kind of interact and see the neighbors naturally as they would move by. It's kind of a reverse of that trend that happened beginning in the 1950s of moving back into backyards. This is kind of pushing back, pushing some of life into the front yard. Second idea is to move activities to the front yard. Something that I've just been doing recently with my kids is just playing catch with a football in the street. Now, we could go to a park, we could go to different places, but I'm just kind of playing in the street. And that has been a fantastic way. Everyone who's walking by, walking their dog, we have interactions with and get to talk to them, and we just become more presence, right? And the more you do that, the more other people might come and join in. So moving activities to the front yard. Number 3, sinking chores, right? This idea comes, I was talking to a friend in this church, and she was confessing after last week. She said, you know what I realized is every week I have to move the cans out to the front, and then the next day I have to move them back. And she said, you know what I do? I look out the window to see if my neighbors are outside, and if they are outside, I wait till they're no longer outside, and then I go get my cans, right? Which is like, and she's like, and I like my neighbors, and I know my neighbors. I don't know why I do that, right? Well, we could simply just do the opposite. We could say, you know what? Hey, they're moving their cans. Let me go move my cans, and maybe we'll have a little chat along the way. Very simple, small changes. Number 4, you could give food. A lot of you have gardens in the backyard, and you have extra produce, and some of you, it's awesome. Some of you give it to friends, you give it to people at church. You could actually give that to neighbors and say, hey, you know what, I grew extra cucumbers. I thought you might want some of that. Some of you are great at baking brownies, baking cookies, and we have a neighbor that makes jam, is frequently bringing that over to our house. So there's something that you actually can create and say, hey, I just thought you might want this. Or, I've heard of people who are like, hey, there was buy one, get one free on a bag of potatoes, and I just thought, hey, I can't eat them all, but maybe you would like them. You can just come up with something that you can use to bless your neighbors. I said 5, but I actually only had 4, so the 5th one could be whatever you think of. I want you to just take a minute with your neighbor and say, which of these ideas is best, and then what's a better idea? All right, let's take a minute right now. All right, quick poll. Raise your hand if you like number 1 the best. Number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. Oh, all right. So a bunch of different ones, but sounds like there's going to be some cookies and cucumbers getting distributed all around Milpitas and San Jose. That would be awesome. One idea I heard was someone said, I think that you could bake something and we could give that. I'm sure that's going to be a number of us. Hey, I just want to challenge you. Let's try. I mean, we're not going to go from kindergarten to graduate school right away, but maybe we can take some baby steps, learn some names, bless someone, kind of pray for someone. Those might be just some real practical steps that we can do, even from the place of our busy lives, to start to obey Jesus more. And I think that just imagine the change that could sweep over our community if all of us just started knowing, loving, praying for the people around us. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for this call. We trust that this command of yours is actually in our best interest, that it's also for your glory. Lord, we just pray that you'd help us do it, even though it's hard, even though there's so much in us that resists. We just pray that you would just do some miracles through us of progress. And we just pray that you would be honored and glorified through our efforts. In Jesus' name, amen. And now may the God that loves you and created the world and created every person that you've ever known send you out into that world to love people in his name. May he fill you with hope and peace and courage as you go. And may the world praise him as they see you living out his call. God bless you.